Should we do it at the same time, or how is it? Three,
Three,
two,
two,
one.
Oh, that was a
Worst.
cracker.
So nobody said that this video interview thing would be easy. In this video, I'm sitting down and talking with Alister Benn. He's a Scottish landscape photographer, and I wanted to talk with him for a very long time. I think this is our third interview and talk. We've had to redo it a few times. And this video, I'm mainly interviewing Alister, and then we've also made a video for his channel that will come out either tomorrow or one of the following days, where he interviews me. We are going deep into different photography topics, like creativity and progression and more the meditative states of photography. So it is super interesting. There is nothing about settings and camera equipment in this, so if you look for that, you might as well just turn off now. This is about humans and photography. So without further ado, have a listen. All right, so welcome people of the world to this conversation with Alister Benn. I've been looking very much forward to talk to Alister. He has a fantastic YouTube channel where he shares all sorts of philosophical, creative ideas, and he has a great series going on that's called Vision and Light. He started it out with his our co-YouTuber, Adam Gibbs. And he is talking a lot with a lot of different photographers, and it's just super interesting to hear their thoughts. But enough about me talking. Over to you, Alister. Who are you? And yeah, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to us doing this in two parts. So you've been kind enough to have me on your channel, and then I'll reciprocate with an interview with you on Vision and Light in a couple of weeks' time. So who am I? Right, well, I'm a Scottish landscape photographer. I live on the west coast of Scotland. I've been shooting professionally for over a decade, maybe 12 years since I turned pro. And it was a transition like many of my peers, which is we had proper jobs and careers for a good chunk of our adult lives. I was in international finance and lived in the Far East for 15 or 16 years. So when I got back into photography, it suddenly became this all-consuming passion that basically not only gave my life some kind of meaning that I think it didn't have before, but also realized that there was a better way to live my life using the landscape and photography and creativity and my communication skills to try and add value, I guess, to landscape photography.
Fantastic. Yeah, I kind of just like got my education and then completely changed direction. So yeah, right. I had like half a year in a photography store. Find out very quickly that that's not the same as being a photographer. But at least I got a few tips and learned a little bit about, you know, running a business. So it wasn't for nothing, and I got the contrast to how it is to do your own stuff. So you really get like
right.
that. I don't want to work in a store for like 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. I can earn less and have a better life. So yeah. But all right. So what is your history and what is your progression with landscape photography? Were there some kind of like, you know, significant learning points, frustrations, and challenges, and so forth?
Right. How long have you got? I actually started as a bird photographer. That was my primary interest. I was living in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and I started seeing a load of amazing bird photographs from Malaysia by people using their telescopes with digital cameras shooting through the telescope, and it was a thing called digiscoping. And I had a fancy Leica telescope back then, so I thought, well, I'll just get a point and shoot, and you can connect it to the telescope. So I started doing that, and very quickly realized that the type of bird photography I was interested in, which is dynamic, flying birds and action and things, required much more expensive and professional equipment. So very quickly I dived into that whole thing, and really until about 2007, I was predominantly a bird photographer. I was traveling all over Asia photographing birds, and spent a couple of winters in the San Francisco area as well. So that traveling kind of exposed me to some amazing landscapes, Banff National Park, Jasper, Moab and Arches National Park, Yosemite, and I think even though I was still primarily a bird photographer, I had a sense of wonder about the landscape. So I think when I started to think about transitioning into a professional career, landscapes made more sense. By that time I was living in the Himalaya, I was living in Tibet. And the idea of being a bird photographer living in Tibet and trying to make a living seemed a little bit obscure. So my kind of journey into landscape photography was really, I guess it was commercial, partly, but equally I knew I wanted to have a career in photography, and it seemed like the most likely channel. In terms of the second part of your question, challenges and so forth, I think every day that you're self-employed is a challenge. There's never enough hours in the day. You always feel like you're at work. You always feel like you could be doing something else. If I pick up a guitar, I always feel, well, maybe I should be writing that article instead. So I think that you're always feeling slightly conflicted. But I guess we can go on to talk about maybe some of the sort of specific challenges, I suppose. But yeah, that's a big question. Maybe we need to break that one down a little bit more.
I'm actually very happy to hear that you feel like leisure time comes with with the frustrations of you have to do something else instead, because I feel exactly the same. Like I can work 24/7 if I wanted to, but I have to force myself to take a little bit of time off also, and just have to, it can wait for tomorrow, there's no pressure. So
I think this is the big myth about being a professional landscape photographer. I think there's an idea that it's just about being out in the countryside all the time making photographs, and that is a tiny part of it. You know yourself with running a YouTube channel, we're producing 2 videos a week, the Vision and Light and a regular video on a Sunday. And all of that stuff needs to be prepared, recorded. These sessions take time and preparation. So I think it's putting yourself first is a key thing. I force myself, it sounds like a horrible thing to have to do, I force myself to play guitar for a couple of hours a day because I need that time to just not be making photography related content. So yeah, it's very important to understand that your brain needs space in which to be creative as well.
Exactly, yeah. It's also just about getting other kinds of input. For the past couple of weeks, me and my girlfriend Sophie, we have been digging through a lot of different documentaries about history on Danish radio. It would be like your BBC. There are so many amazing documentaries about history and the 18th, 19th century. 18th century, it must be like 1800s.
That's the 19th century.
Yeah, 19th century. And just how they were thinking creativity, the painters and so forth. Back then, it's so interesting. You get so many inputs because my education is not in technically it is in the art, because that's the university degree I have, but it's not in the creativity. So it's super interesting to get all these things in, because I have just learned everything by myself when it comes to photography through YouTube. I haven't got an art degree of any sorts. So it's nice to get those inputs and thoughts, how art has progressed through history. Very interesting.
Yeah, and we're just points on a timeline at the end of the day. We our contribution to art or society is very transient. But yeah, I get easily sidetracked, so you better whip me back into line.
Me too. Okay, so how was it that you started out with landscape photography? What kind of landscape photography? How would you describe it yourself when you started out, and where are you now, and how has that progression. Can you put some words on that progression?
Right. That's a good point, because I think I'm all about not breaking rules, just abandoning rules. You know, I'm very anti-rules. I'm very anti-restraint. And when I remember the first landscape photograph I ever took, I'll send it to you and you can put it up now. This is absolutely the very first landscape shot I took as a kind of grown up.
Yeah.
And I was on Vancouver Island, and I was just out walking through the forest, and I saw this thing, and it just seemed like the most natural thing in the world to photograph. And I wasn't thinking about composition, I wasn't thinking about rules, I wasn't thinking about, oh, that needs to be there because, you know, there was no analysis. It was just a pure, innate pointing my camera at the world, and it felt like a very fluid and intuitive thing to do. And I started taking photographs like that. It was just, oh, that's really cool, point my camera at it. And it could have been the big landscape, or more often than not, it was slightly more intimate scenes, I guess. This is like 2003 or something. And I started posting my images on a forum, naturescapes.net, and then later naturephotographers.net. I joined there too. And that was the only real outlet for photography in the early 2000s. I think I joined Naturescapes in 2004. And I started putting my images on there, and you started getting critiques. And some of the people who were critiquing you would criticize you for certain decisions that you made. Yeah. Other people were very supportive, other people were more critical. And you could tell there was a kind of generation gap between some people who were very rigid and structured and confined, that photographs have to look this way.
Tell me about it.
Right. And it still happens. It still totally happens. And then there was people who were just like, oh, you know, more arty, who were more forgiving at lots of different decisions. So I went on a journey for about probably 5 years after that, 5 or 6 years of learning everything I could about composition. You know, reading like university level fine art degree courses on composition and visual design and the psychology of visual design and all of this stuff, color theory. You know, I became a real technical nerd, just hoovering in all this information. And what happened was, by about 2010, I could make pretty photographs anywhere. You know, I could go out into the landscape, see something, understand that this and this was the composition, and point my camera at it, and it would be all very nice, and then process it well. But I had no emotional connection with them at all. I mean, it was just this repetitive. And I got to a point where I just thought, I'm sick of this. You know, I just felt so disillusioned. I felt so lost in there was no creative process. It was literally just making photographs by numbers. And it was almost like templates. And when I went out into the landscape, I would see templates. And it wasn't until, and this continued through the 2010s, so that even by 2015, 16, I could teach landscape photography, and I was moving in a more intuitive way. And the big epiphany for me was going to the Gobi Desert in January of 2017. And over the next 3 years, I went 7 times to the Gobi. And all of a sudden, all the rules change, because you don't have classic foreground, midground, background arrangements. And I was lost. The first couple of days in the Gobi, I was really lost. And I just decided, I'm going to go back to how I did this 15, 16, 17 years ago. And if I see something that engages my attention, I'll point my camera at it. And really, that's where I am now, and that's what I teach, is that rules are just blinkers. I was having this chat with, I think it was Paul Ziska, we were talking about it, and basically said that rules are a fast track to becoming the same as everybody else.
Yeah,
and
that's...
To me, it's like creativity is about being you. I had a chat with David Johnson yesterday and TJ Thorne on Tuesday, and we were talking about this very thing, about how important it is for us to feel as if we can have our voice. You know, Mads has a voice, Alister has a voice, Anne Christine has a voice, Guy Tal has a voice. And what are the chances if you put us all in a room and asked us our opinion about something that we would give you the same answer?
Hopefully not.
Well, some things we will agree on,
Yeah.
but most things, when it comes down to intuitive, creative, and emotional responses to things, we have a lot of uniqueness about us. So that's where my passion these days is in self-expression, self-affirmation, feeling valid through your own appraisal of yourself rather than relying on external judgment. So, I mean, that is a hell of a long answer to a question that you asked about 15 minutes ago. But, you poke me with things like this and I will just pour my heart out with passion about, because our journey as landscape photographers is most of it is trying to overcome the pressure to try and fit in. And I did that for 10 or 15 years, trying to fit in, trying to be popular, trying to make images that would make me successful, all that type of stuff. Whereas now, I make images that I love, and hopefully enough people like them that I can have a business.
Yeah, I have like 10 things I could just latch onto what you just said. It's just so interesting because obviously I would consider myself fairly early in my journey as a landscape photographer, given that I continue to be a landscape photographer for a long time. As I said, I'm also just learning, and I can definitely feel that some of it does become fairly formulaic when you are out. It feels actually more technical than creative when you're out. You need to have this foreground, you use these leading lines, and you're kind of looking for the same. So as you said, templates. But on the other hand, I've also always enjoyed pursuing, the unique and the different. But for the most part, I'm often in locations that are fairly iconic. So it is hard to get anything which is super unique. So but we can talk more about this in my interview. We will do next time.
Yes, definitely. I'll look forward to that.
All right. So you transitioned from the epic landscapes and the formulaic landscapes and so forth, and you are more towards the intimate scenes and what you latch on to. I guess very unintentional. I guess just you go look and then you see something and point your camera. And what would you say defines an Alister Benn photo now, if you can even put that into words?
Right. I've written quite a few articles about the whole concept of personal style.
Yeah.
And I used to believe quite strongly in it, that we do develop a personal style. And I guess, for a period of about 5 years there, you would have looked at some of my photographs and they were very dark and very moody and, quite high contrast and, some melancholy, or, there was a kind of emotional mood to them, I suppose. Whereas now I think I'm out of that a little bit. I do still like dark images, but I have a broader spectrum of kind of emotional output now. I would still shoot a dramatic landscape. I'm less interested in going to iconic landscapes these days. I prefer to photograph either alone or just with a small number of people. I could take no pleasure in going and standing at Mesa Arch. You will never see a Mesa Arch photograph from me because I've got no desire to go there and be shoulder to shoulder with 50 other photographers all trying to get the same shot. So that type of thing doesn't interest me at all. I could quite easily go to Yosemite Valley and not photograph Tunnel View or something like that. So I'm not particularly drawn to that type of landscape because I think photographs like that tell you more about the landscape and less about yourself. Whereas if I find some out of focus grasses layered with droplets of light behind them, then I can lose myself in that for half an hour, So because I think I've got to the stage where I've decided that photographic output is important. You can see I've got the big Canon P1000 behind me now. I've decided that printing again is very important to my life. So producing some tangible thing, you know, a piece of art has become very important to me. But it's, and again, I was talking quite a lot with TJ Thorne and David Johnson about this. It's the act of being in the landscape with engagement that enriches my life. Yeah, the business and the popularity and success of running a business pays the bills to a certain extent, but it's those moments in the landscape that define my life. And they're the things I'll look back on when I'm old and greyer, with fondness and just thinking, that's when I was alive. That's when I was truly alive. So I think the photographs that mean the most to me are really moments where I was in that state. Now, I'm more likely to be in that state in an anonymous landscape than in a big landscape. So I think what defines an Alister Benn photograph, I guess, is moments of intimacy where I'm probably in a flow state, which means I'm fully engaged with the landscape and not really conscious of the outside world at all. Stylistically, it's super diverse. I mean, it can literally be, you know, a 400 mil Himalayan mountain in the mist, like I posted yesterday, or you know, like I said, out of focus grasses with little spots of light in twilight or something like that. I mean, I wouldn't say I've got a particular subject that I'm known for or a style necessarily that I like to have this big broad spectrum. I'm going to bang on for so long here. I think I live on an emotional spectrum where I can have a tendency to be quite introverted and insular and kind of introspective, and I have other moments where I'm more gregarious and exuberant and sort of extrovert-ish. And I think all of those facets of my personality have images that could be kind of attributed to those emotional states. So if I go into the landscape doesn't give a damn who we are or how famous we are or how expensive our camera is or what brand of SD card we use. The landscape just does its thing, and it's who we are when we go into the landscape that has the most impact on what comes out creatively from that. And I think if we go into the landscape in a quiet, melancholy, introspective mood, we should be open to making images that reflect that, rather than going out feeling a little bit fearful and not very extrovert and expecting to take dramatic, grand landscapes when we're feeling pressurized by the world. So that's like another very long answer.
So I really appreciate these very long answers because there's so much insight to it, and I really appreciate how different we are as photographers, that there's different things that motivates us. And obviously that will hopefully create different kinds of photographs if we're just staying true to ourselves. Of course we can be influenced from the outside. I don't think any human cannot be influenced from the outside, right. But the question is what we let us be influenced by, and that is of course something we have to do more or less consciously. I don't know how that specifically works, but you have kind of answered, but I'm super curious to hear, when you go out into the landscapes, do you get that childish excitement? Because I remember when I came talking of the tunnel view for the first time I was in Yosemite, to me that was such a big thing, because this is like the epitome of a landscape photograph, and I think it's more for cultural reasons that I was so excited about it, but right. I was there, I stood there, I saw this iconic place, and I was super excited. I had goosebumps, and yeah. Do you get that childish excitement still?
Yes, yeah, I do. And I think it's really important not to lose that childish excitement. And again, I was talking to Marcel about this, Marcel van Oosten, and that he's one of the most famous landscape photographers in the world. He's one of the most successful. He does films for Nikon when they release new cameras, and I mean he's he's a big guy. And we were talking about this childlike enthusiasm when we're in the landscape, and he hasn't lost it, and he's one of the most successful landscape photographers in the business. So I think Mark Adamus is the same. When you see the guy in the field, I was in Tibet with him in 2015 running an expedition together for 3 weeks, running around the Himalaya in Tibet. And the guy's just running around like a maniac, just overjoyed with the exuberance of being in the landscape. So yeah, I totally get it, but I get it every day. I mean, I can look out the kitchen window into the garden and the way the sunlight backlights grasses, I can get excited about. Or just the play of light on a hillside, or, it doesn't, it's been a while since I've been to, living on the west of Scotland, we live in near Glencoe and on the Isle of Skye and stuff like that. So, there are some iconic landscapes here, but it's been a while since I've been in a really famously iconic place. The last 5 or 6 years, I've been most of my time in quiet locations. Next year, we're going to be in the States for probably 3 or 4 months. And I'll be in Yosemite, and I'm going to be in Oregon and the Rockies, and various places that are super famous in Utah and Arizona. So it'll be interesting to kind of see what it will be like going there. I don't think you can stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and not feel awe. But I think the important thing is to truly appreciate it. It's every conversation these days round about contemporary photography seems to slag off people photographing icons, and I think that's really unfair, because it's like saying, well, I have a full tummy, why are you hungry? It's that type of thing. So I think that's really super unfair. But I think understanding what we can do in these places, and sure, yes. So the short answer is yes. I still totally get overwhelmed by, and if I did go back to tunnel view, I'd be thinking about Alex Honnold and free solo and how it would be to be up there without a rope, and just the fascination of human endeavor and things like that. Plus the whole geology and the history of the place, and Ansel Adams, and we're a tiny little spot in the universe.
Exactly. Okay, so speaking of the universe, as you just said, because I have a big interest for astronomy, and I know you have a big interest for astronomy. Do you see your interest for astronomy, or maybe background in astronomy, to influence either your photography or the way you think in regard to photography?
Can I just ask anyone watching this, pause it and go and make a cup of coffee? Right, just a bit of background. I was born in Glasgow on the west coast of Scotland, so obviously a city, and I grew up in a city until I was 12, and then when I was 12, my family moved out into the countryside, into the Highlands of Scotland. So my formative years were in the countryside, and we had a river near the bottom of the garden, and I could go fly fishing and stuff like that. And I was really into rock climbing, and I was really into hiking and mountaineering and stuff. So I'd spend a lot of my time out in the landscape, camping, when I was like 14, 15, 16 type of thing. And so yes, looking up at the stars and asking these questions, why are we here? How are we here? And it can be daunting. You can end up asking questions of yourself that twist your mind towards insanity. It's a pretty scary road to go down. But I did end up doing a couple of years of astronomy and astrophysics at university. And although I never pursued a career in astrophysics or astronomy, it was always something that was interesting, and I probably kept up to date for about a decade after I left university, just reading scientific papers and research and stuff. And then I went on to read an awful lot of philosophy and psychology, because there's a very fine line between philosophy and faith. There's a very fine line between philosophy and science. So, all of this information is kind of there to be digested to a certain extent. So how it impacts my photography is, I guess, an inquisitiveness that I've always had, and that, I believe, is a childlike quality. I think when we're children, we tend to be very inquisitive. How many times have our parents smacking us on the hand and telling us to keep our hands out of drawers or, you know, in supermarket shelves and all this type of stuff. So we're inquisitive. And I think just that quest for understanding my place in the universe, I think, has been a big thing for me. It's caused me some anxiety over the years. I've spoken quite openly about having been depressed and anxious for a number of years, and I'm out of that now. I'm out the other side of that, and it's very interesting to look back on why I was anxious. And an awful lot of it was trying to fit in. It was trying to be normal or some perception of normal. But so yeah, you know, my interest in space, I did write a book on night photography. That was the first book I ever wrote. I researched it between 2009 and 2012 because there wasn't one back then. You know, mine was almost the very first book on night photography that didn't rely on rules of thumb.
Wow.
So when I released this book, it was a bit of a game changer. So the stuff like the long exposure, the short exposure, high ISO test shot was something I kind of came up with in like 2009 or something. Yeah. So yeah, it was a book that I was very proud of at the time. So yes, I spent years just out shooting night photography. Funnily enough, it's not something I do very much of now. I think I did so much of it back then that I got a little bit sick of it.
Yeah, it's funny
because I know you're really into it. I know you do a lot of night photography.
But that's the fun thing. I actually haven't.
Right.
I did quite a lot in the US, and I pursued this Milky Way thing, and that was also like, you know, I started doing my composite stuff because we only had like, out of those 40 days, 1 or 2 nights with a really good Milky Way because of the moon phases, and we were in Death Valley when we caught it, so, and we were way out of season. We were there in December. So to get around the problems, I'd actually have some Milky Way photos. That was how I also like started with the composite stuff. So for the most part, many of my composite photos, it's the exact same Milky Way I use. And I have been out since I was in Gran Canaria last year, actually precisely a year ago. Where we also spent an entire night photographing the Milky Way, but there was a little bit too much light pollution. So I'm not completely satisfied with those photos. But yeah, I think there's so many things I want to do, and staying up the entire night to photograph the Milky Way is not one I prioritize that much anymore, because the outcome, even though I really like Milky Way photos, it does have a tendency to become very much the same. It's like, you know, find some kind of foreground and stick the Milky Way behind it. And
it is super formulaic.
It's very formulaic, yeah, and I think that's it's. I like the end result, but you can only see so many Milky Way photos before you really see the pattern in them. So,
totally.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that was probably one of the reasons I kind of drifted away from night photography, is it's so technical.
Yeah.
You know, there's very little margin for error in terms of, you know, focus and getting good exposures and then getting good foreground exposures. And it's a very technical thing, and, you know, getting enough depth of field. And, you know, if you've got to invest 3 or 4 hours in the field to make a photograph, funnily enough, on Facebook the other day, I posted a photograph of Skogafoss with a moon bow and star trails, and it was the first night shot I think I've processed in about 8 or 9 years, and it reminded me how little I enjoy it. Just, you know, nice result, but, you know, I think it was about 3 hours in the field and then probably an hour and a half in front of the computer, and I just thought, nah.
Yeah. It was also fun with you're from Scotland and I'm from Denmark, and we are just about the same latitude, I think. Longitude,
we're 57
latitude.
north.
Yeah. And we're at a place where the Milky Way is not really that fun. Well, the most interesting parts of the Milky Way, the core, isn't really visible before like either very late at night during spring, and then we have to go beyond midsummer and have to wait until like August for it to be dark enough. And
that's right.
Yeah, so it's only like, you know, August, September-ish where you can actually get like if you want a very powerful photo of the Milky Way, you only have like a very small window. So it comes with some problems, simply just because of our geography. I still really enjoy shooting the Northern Lights. There's some kind of technical dance I love in that, because you have to adjust all the time if you're on a night with a lot of activity. So that there's some kind of like, you know, there's some kind of challenge there that I still enjoy, even though that's also becoming fairly formulaic, because it's more or less the same thing. Find the foreground and then have the beautiful display there, and hope for something good to happen.
There's not many great ones out there.
No. But it's challenging and it's fun.
Yeah.
All right. So. We are coming up on, I think, 35 minutes-ish. So I really want to talk about something that you are very passionate about, and that's creativity. Can you share some thoughts on first what it is, and what are your thoughts about it? We have time.
Creativity is something I've thought an awful lot about, like probably at least a decade of fairly deep thought on what creativity is. I don't think it's something that I'm not interested in any form of dictionary definition or societally acceptable definition. My own perspective on my own creativity is when I produce something, obviously a photograph, that is unique and represents a period of my life where I was totally engaged with the thing that is representing. So I don't want to become judgmental. I try not to be judgmental. And if I am, it's usually because I'm trying to simplify statements. So going to an iconic place and putting your tripod where everyone else has put their tripod and lined up the waterfall and the rock and the tree and the mountain, regardless of how great or poor the light is, has small amounts of creativity in it. Now you can process that in a creative way should you have the skill or intuition to do so, but the composition has been seen 100,000 times before. Yeah. So I don't think there's a lot of creativity in that. I think I did a video on creativity last year, and I was using guitar playing as an example. And I'm a big Pink Floyd fan, a big Dave Gilmour fan. So if I pick up one of the guitars there and play the solo out of Another Brick in the Wall and change 2 notes, that's not creativity either. Yeah, that's just playing Another Brick in the Wall and improvising slightly on it, but it's not creativity. So I think for me, creativity is more, you're not going to find it reading a book. You're not going to find it looking at other people's work. You're not going to find it by searching for it. I truly believe that my epiphany when it came to my own creativity was when I stopped looking out and started looking in. Because creativity, I think, is like enlightenment in the sort of classic Buddhist sense. That the thing about enlightenment is it's not something you find, it's the realization that you already are. Yeah. So I think creativity is the same. It's a realization that you are already creative, and it's just you haven't found your, I don't want to say voice because I think that's a bit of a cliche, but I think all of us have the capacity to be unique. All of us have the capacity to be creative. So this is why I'm very against the teaching of photography as a do this, then this, then this, then this, and then here's a bunch of presets that you can click a button and all of a sudden your image looks incredible. That's not creativity either. It's like having this keyboard and pushing a button and it plays Mozart's Requiem. You know, it's not creativity. So now that sounds kind of harsh, but I don't want that to sound discouraging, because you can be creative with a single line. You know, creativity doesn't have to be complex.
Absolutely.
Creativity can be super simple.
Yeah.
So I think what I would urge people who are watching this to do, because everyone struggles with their creativity, it's probably the most asked about topic on workshops that I've been running for nearly a decade, is I want to be more creative. How can I become more creative? And the answer is that you have to stop giving too much notice of what other people are telling you should be doing, you know, because instantly you're not being creative. If you're singing, or if you're dancing to somebody else's song, you're just. I had a chat with a guy recently, and he was saying that when he's on workshops, if he doesn't like someone's photograph, he'll tell them how to make it the way he would like it, and that's opinion. Yeah, there's no definitive right or wrong. So I'm very forgiving. I think a beginner can pick up a camera and go out and make extremely creative photographs, and they will continue to do so until someone who has a bigger opinion of themselves than they should tells them that they're wrong.
Yeah.
I've seen too many people coming from camera clubs where someone's assassinated their work. No, that's too dark, that's too contrasty, that's too this, that's too that. When if that was the way they liked it and that was the way they wanted to do it, then great. I think that's why I did that big series of videos on compositional consequences. There's a consequence of everything we do, and understanding what those consequences are. So if something's too saturated or very saturated, there's a consequence to that. You know, you can push colors out of the realm of believability. And once you've crossed that line, people are going to start pulling back from it. So it's all about engagement, impact, the emotional impact of our photographs. So I think creativity can be summarized in do what feels right to you without really caring too much about what other people think about it.
Amen to that.
Well, you know, that's my answer at 10 to 10 on a Friday morning.
Yeah.
It might be different on Monday.
I actually had one final question, but I think I want to latch onto it, because one thing is to be in the nature and being creative in the nature. So then when we touched a little bit about on it, but then we go in and start processing our images. How do you go about the creative process when you are editing the photo? Do you just like pull around the sliders and be like, oh, this looks pretty, let's move on with this? Or do you have some kind of like, you know, initial idea, let's go in this direction?
Right, that's another interesting question. I used to latch onto the idea of visualization. So probably in the mid 2000s, that was what I was reading, is that the concept of visualization was quite en vogue back then. You know, go out into the field, and that's very much a slide film, color slide film mentality. You have to visualize the final photograph when you're in the field. Now, obviously, without getting into the big technical discussion about raw files and that type of thing, a raw file is not a final photograph under any stretch of the imagination. Digital medium require different exposure to bring out the best of the data. You know, it's the big expose to the right, watch the highlights mantra. So the way we expose raw files tends to make them quite explicit if they're exposed well. So all raw files require processing to realize some kind of creative vision. Now, what was happening, and it was about 2014 when I was getting super busy with workshops, is that I would go out and photograph, so say like in Mount Assiniboine in the Rockies in October or September 2014, and I think I didn't get around to processing the photographs, or some of the photographs, until the spring of the following year. So it was like about 6 or 7 months time had elapsed. And my methodology had always been, okay, I've got to make a photograph that somehow represents the spirit of that moment, yeah? And I found it impossible. So much had happened in my life in that 6 or 7 months, I couldn't even remember the type of person I was in September 2014. So I struggled to make photographs that represented that moment. But what I realized was, sat in front of the computer, I was making images that represented who I was now. Yeah. So if I started processing a photograph now, it's who I am now is having the most impact. So what I started to do then was I would split in the field and processing into 2 separate creative acts. So when I'm in the field, it's all about engagement and flow and intuition and creative awareness, and it's almost a meditative state for me. So it's a very fluid, floaty, non-conscious act most of the time for me. When I'm in front of the computer, it's subdivided into utility. If I'm making photographs to illustrate an article, it's very conscious because the image has to represent the point that I want to make. Or if I'm writing an article and I need an image to go alongside a point, I'll find something and I'll work it very precisely to illustrate that point. If I don't get the chance to sit down and be truly creative very often anymore. The pressures on my day are just too much most of the time. I try to make an hour for myself every day now where at the end of the day, before dinner or after dinner, I'm going to sit here and just do my own thing. And what I find is that the images that I choose to process are telling me how I feel at that point in time. So whether it's a high contrasty scene or a low contrast scene or an atmospheric scene or a graphic dynamic scene, or it's all about light, or it's all about contrast, or it's about detail, or it's whatever. So whatever I choose to process in that moment, if I just go with it, as soon as I see it, I almost have a visualization of where I want to take that. Now, in the past, I've kind of taught that as a much more fluid process. I am probably trying to make myself more structured in that now, in that I want to take my time, I want to be more precise, and that's what this printer's doing, is forcing me to be precise. If you're processing an image for a 800 pic web post, you don't have to be precise. You can be super sloppy. I can do it in 2 minutes for Insta, and it would look almost the same as if I'd taken 2 hours. Because there's not a big difference, really. No. You're talking about tiny, tiny details which show up on a print, but they don't show up on 800 pics. So again, the creative process for me in front of the computer, if I'm purely being creative, yeah, sometimes I'll be experimental, I'll just try something. You know, I think by the time you understand the tools, you kind of know what's going to happen before you move the slider.
Yeah.
So there's not many surprises anymore, I suppose, but there were a decade ago. But yeah, I mean, it's all about shutting off the world. It's all about forgetting about politics and all the horrible things that people do to each other. It's about engaging with nature and releasing those demons to a certain extent.
Great. Alister, we are probably at 50 minutes or so. It has been absolutely such a wonderful talk, and there are so many things I would love to latch onto, and it will just make everything twice as long. Let's do that for your channel with me instead. And I want to say a huge thank you for being part of this photography conversation. It was more of an interview, I guess, this one here. But yeah, there's so many good points here, and I bet that people who actually listen all the way through the end will get so much out of it. So thank you so much for being on.
You're welcome, Mads. Listen, it was a real pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to part 2, where I can turn the camera on you instead.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And as always, guys out there, if you enjoyed this episode, I would highly appreciate a like, and let me know what you thought about this episode. Did it start some thoughts in you? And yeah, just share it down in the comments. So thank you so much for watching and listening, and see you in the next video.